You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your host, Thomas Ahrens. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Fishing the DMV. I'm your host, Thomas Ahrens, and today we have a guest favorite on the show, Jason Hallacher. We're going to be talking about the Shenandoah watershed, what's going on with it, and what he's been up to. So just before we get into the slides, how have you been?
I've been really good, Thomas. Going over a lot of the data that we've collected this year on all the rivers. Mostly good news. We'll get into all of that. But at this time of year, you know, we're kind of doing what anglers are doing. We're working on our boats, getting ready for sampling. You know, all week this week we've been doing a lot of maintenance. That's a lot of the stuff that really doesn't get mentioned behind the scenes with all the sampling work we do. You know, the equipment has to work if we're going to get good data. So been doing a lot of that and just kind of getting ready for the holidays and enjoying our time here in the fall and early winter.
When does maintenance season start for you, generally speaking?
We try to go through a pretty rigorous maintenance regimen this month in December. We spend about a week and a half going through all of our boats, you know, bearings, motors, electrofishing equipment, just getting stuff cleaned up, our nets, you name it. And we've got a pretty good regimen now where we can go, you know, throughout the year without worrying about, you know, too many hiccups. You know, you always lose a bearing on a trailer every now and then or get a flat tire on 81. But for the most part, you know, if we're really diligent about going through our gear this time of year and taking care of the ethanol issue, of course, then everything works throughout the season and we don't have to do much, you know, throughout the year.
So guys, I'm really excited about this. Just like the other interviews that we're doing for this huge collaboration, we're going to be going through the PowerPoints. We're going to go just, you know, point by point. So if any questions come up, that way it'll flow a little bit easier so people don't get lost in all the sauce. So let me see if I can reshare my screen there. All right. And then there's your beautiful mug on slide 1.
Yeah, there we are. This is a really cool project. I'm glad that we can collaborate with you on this. You know, within our agency, we have a warm water streams committee. And so all the biologists from around the state that work on warm water resources, basically fish that aren't trout, get together and discuss issues, regulations, and discuss their waters and how things are doing. And we put together these popular reports, put them on our website, and feel free to go and check those out. They're updated, you know, every probably 2 to 3 years on some of the major waters. But, you know, it's hard to get clicks. And so we thought of this idea, this collaboration, just to try to get the word out about our resources and try to reach a broader audience. So, you know, we'll, of course, be sharing this eventually on our platforms as well. So, yeah, this is really exciting. And so today, you know, I'm just going to talk about the Shenandoah River. You know, I manage the North Fork, the South Fork, and the main stem. And so I'm going to try not to get too far into the weeds, but I'm going to go through each one and talk about the state of the fishery and then just how we sample and stuff like that. So, Thomas, you know, feel free to interrupt and ask the obvious questions that pop up, and I'm going to try to do my best to explain these graphs. You know, this is probably best viewed on YouTube rather than just listened to, but I'm going to try my best to summarize things. So let's talk a little bit about how we sample these rivers. The North Fork's a little different. You know, it's a smaller river. Historically, we had sampled that river with a handful of sites with our boat electrofishing units, but it was challenging because the pools were really restricted and they were pretty deep. And so you just don't get a great sample of smallmouth. We'd catch largemouth, sunfish, different non-game fish. But over time, you know, if the river was too low or we lost access, you know, it was just challenging. And so when we got our raft electrofishing unit, this opened up a whole new world for us as far as sampling our smaller rivers. And so we use that now on the Maury River and the North Fork Shenandoah River. We also have used it on the cow pasture over the years as well. You have to, of course, target the right flows. We sample in the spring instead of the fall. And this shift has occurred back in 2013. And we've found that we really get a much nicer sample of the population, more comprehensive. We can hit a variety of different habitats. And the way that we set it up is we have 3 6-mile floats. In the North Fork, there's an upper, middle, and lower section. The upper section is from Newmarket down to the Quicksburg area. The middle section is from the Burnshire Dam down to Pew's Run, and the lower section is from Deer Rapids down to Strasburg. And we do 4 runs, and they're 30 minutes each. And we do 2 bass only runs, and then 2 everything runs, looking for sunfish and catfish and other species that come up. Compare that to the South Fork and the main stem. Because we have more water and more room to run there, we use our jet boats.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we have a lot more sites. On the South Fork, we have 9 sites. We do slightly shorter runs because we do catch, a good number of fish, and we don't want to overwhelm our live wells. The main stem, we have 3 sites, 4 runs, 15 minutes each is the standard for that. And by timing our runs, we can generate a catch rate. And this is something that's used, nationally. It's called catch per unit of effort. It's how many fish per hour of sampling. And so you'll see on our graphs coming up, CPUE, which is catch per unit of effort. And that's how many bass we're catching per hour. It doesn't mean that you're going to catch that many bass per hour. It's just a metric that we can go by and compare from year to year. And when we're sampling, our primary focus is game fish. Our agency manages our bass, musky, walleye, trout, all those game fish species intensively. And so we're looking at IDing each fish, measuring them, weighing them, and sometimes we'll sacrifice a few for age and growth work to determine their mortality rates and how fast they grow.
I would like at the end of this presentation to talk anecdotally about the sunfish population and suckers, just what you've seen too, because I know flathead allegedly were seen in the main stem, so we can circle back to that at the end.
Yeah, it's not allegedly; they are in there.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. Wow. We will talk about that going forward here, but I will mention the sunfish. Spoiler alert, the sunfish populations look fantastic, and it's been a long time coming. The red breast sunfish is the main species that thrive in this river. We also have decent numbers of rock bass, some bluegill in the slower pools, some green sunfish, every now and then a reddy or a pumpkin seed. But the red breast sunfish is our native sunfish, and it's doing very, very well. And there's some really good quality fish out there. So good news on the sunfish front. Uncertain future as far as the flatheads go, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the North Fork Shenandoah in 2024, this is kind of I'll lead each river with this slide, just the total number of smallmouth collected, just over 300 fish. 45% were considered quality, which is greater than 11 inches. That's a common metric that we use. And then this number was down from 2023, but 45% is very good for the North Fork Shenandoah. It doesn't mean that the river is off the charts, though. The catch rate is still low at only 52 fish per hour. It's up slightly from 2023, but it really hasn't shifted much. The reason that the percentage is so high as far as the quality fish goes is because the middle section of the North Fork is doing fairly well. As far as our floats go, the middle section is our best. We have the best catch rate there, and we have the largest fish there. The upper and the lower sections are not doing nearly as well, and so that middle section is kind of really driving things. All right, for this first graph, essentially these are the average catch rates over time. And so the left one is the total number of fish we catch for each year that we've sampled. And the right graph is just focusing on juveniles. For raft sampling, well, I'll say for boat sampling, we'll talk about young of year. That's fish that are born in the spring of the year. And so we can't really do that with raft sampling because the fish haven't been born yet. We sample in May, whereas with the boat electrofishing on the South Fork and the main stem, we sample in the fall. So this is a little bit complicated, but we look at juvenile fish, which is all fish under 7 inches, and it still gives us a good understanding of what the population is dealing with. You'll notice starting back in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, we've had some pretty good samples back through that time, anywhere from 60 to over 100 fish per hour. That first year in 2013, we must have just crushed it. It's a little bit of an outlier, but for the most part, the population looked great. Good numbers of fish. And then in 2019, you can see it kind of drops off the edge of the world there. And what happened in 2018, we had a really long high water year. Throughout the whole summer and into fall, we had high water events. And something happened to the population during that time. We didn't get a single report of dead fish, but we lost fish. And there was no way to really know what happened because there was no evidence to really follow. And all I can tell you is that, we lost fish during that time and we're on the road to recovery, from here on out. And you can see that the recovery is very slow. And part of that problem is we really haven't had a lot of juveniles in the system for 4 or 5 years. In 2020, there was a pretty good spawn, above average. At certain sites, well above average. But, those fish, those are our quality fish now. Those fish are, 4 or 5 years old at this point. And so we have, good numbers of quality fish in the system, but we don't have a lot of fish coming behind it. 2021 was an average spawn and then just really pretty poor spawning since then. And so that takes the wind out of our sails a little bit as far as getting this fishery back on its feet. And so our hope is that in the future we'll have some better spawning here on the North Fork. This graph here shows the number of quality fish over 11 inches and the number of preferred fish over 14 inches. Quality is in blue, and preferable is in orange. Sorry. And so you can see that, we're pretty well back, with the quality and preferred fish after that big drop off in 2019. That those juveniles that we had right before the loss, they're carrying us. Those 4 and 5 year olds are allowing for those fish are growing into those quality and preferable sizes. So if you are fishing the North Fork, you're not going to get the numbers, but there are bigger fish there for you to catch. And so that's one bright spot as far as the North Fork is concerned. One other bright spot is we've had some success with raising some smallmouth at the Front Royal Hatchery. Our main study area are in 2 sites. They're both 16 kilometers in length. One's in the South Fork, Shenandoah, from Newport to White House. And one is on the South River from Cremora to the town of Grottoes, both 16 kilometers. And those are our priorities because that's really where we're measuring how this program is working or not. And lucky for us, we raised over 30,000 fish this year. And so we had some room to spare. And so we were able to stock 19,000 plus fish into the North Fork this year. As you saw in the previous graph, it needs all the help it can get. And so we outlined 4 sections, 16 to 21 kilometers in length. Most of the sections are within our sample sites, so we'll be able to follow these fish through time. New Market to Mount Jackson was one. Seven Bend State Park to Arts Road was the second one. Helsley Lane to Colby Lane was the third, and then Deer Rapids to Long Meadow Road was the fourth. And so 3 out of the 4 stocking areas we'll be able to go back and sample and try to see how these fish survive. All these fish are marked using oxytetracycline, which is an antibiotic that's commonly used in aquaculture. And this oxytetracycline, or OTC, stains the otolith of the fish that we use to age them. And so you can sacrifice a 1-year-old fish, for example, next spring, and look at the otolith and see if it has that little halo on it. And you'll be able to determine whether it's a stocked fish versus a wild fish. And so there's a little bit of voodoo with that. It can be really challenging to get a good mark using this chemical. But we're hoping that we'll be able to discern wild from stocked using that. And even if we can't, I think we'll be able to see it in our electrofishing data if we're not able to see that mark. So that's really exciting to be able to put a good shot in the arm of the North Fork.
Yeah, and take a bow, because I mean, if people don't know, we had you on the show almost this time last year talking about the program. And would this be year 2 of stocking? Just not this. Of course, year 1 wasn't like as big as this one, but congratulations on 2 years back to back of making this work. They're a hard fish, if you guys don't know, to create, to procreate in captivity. And I'll link that episode because it's fantastic what you guys have done with that.
Yeah, and we've come a long way with it, just in 1 year. We started last year, and we had trouble getting the fish to spawn. There's a lot of stress, on the fish, and as it is with every type of, spawning situation. And so we ended up harvesting some fry from the wild just to see if we could raise them in the new line ponds, because we really didn't get a lot of fry from the fish that we brought into the hatchery. And so we were able to meet our allocation last year, but we used wild fish. And so we couldn't track them genetically like we were planning. So we ended up marking them with OTC. And we did stock some surplus into the North Fork last year as well. We only had enough to stock from the Deer Rapids to Strasburg section. And we're looking at the otoliths now to see if some of the contributions of the juveniles are from the stocked fish. But we did see a bump in numbers of juveniles in that section when we sampled this spring. So that was really encouraging. And I'm hopeful that, some of those stocked fish are helping there.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to that slide, I mean, maybe it's causality, but it's interesting that you have stocked the last 2 years and you did see a bump. And, that would be nice. I would hope that you could say, like, yeah, it's because of what you guys have been able to do with the massive lift that was expected of you.
Yeah, you can see in the right-hand graph here, the 2024 sample, there's sections of the river where, we have a lot less fish as far as juveniles, and sections where we had more, and that upper confidence interval there is, getting pretty close to the average spawning rate. And that's most likely from that lower site where we did see a good number of juveniles down through there. So fingers crossed, we're seeing some positive results there. And 19,000 is nothing to snort at. It's a pretty good shot in the arm. So I think we're going to see some 1-year-olds next year. Again, it's just so tough with the environmental factors. We had a massive drought this year, really low water, really clear. You can imagine how easy it is for the predators to pick off these fish when their habitat is shrunken down and they're forced into areas outside of their typical nursery habitats. So we'll keep our fingers crossed there. Not to mention the big high flow event from Hurricane Helene that came at the end of it. So they kind of went through a little bit of a roller coaster this year.
1-2 punch.
So if they can survive this year, they can survive anything. But I'm not going to lose complete faith if we don't see a lot of response after this stocking, because the environmental factors, the variables there were pretty challenging to overcome.
Were both hit equally as hard, the North Fork and the South Fork?
As far as the high flow events go?
Yeah.
I think the North Fork, if I remember correctly, wasn't hammered quite as hard as the South Fork was. The South River watershed was really hit hard. That was the flooding there was pretty close to a record. And so that really drove the South Fork being the tributary to that river. The North Fork being a little further west got high, but it wasn't, if I remember correctly, it wasn't quite as severe.
Now, I do have a question that a Patreon supporter put on and I couldn't answer is like, what is harder? And this was a month ago when Helena happened. What is harder on fish? Is it the drought that we had or the flood? Because it's topical because we experienced both, it feels like in 60 days. But what is harder on them?
I think that it depends on when the flooding occurs. As far as floods go, I guess the easiest thing to say is, when you have an adult fish in a population, it can handle droughts, it can handle being in deeper water, avoiding predators. Obviously it's stressful. It's, harder to catch prey when it's really clear and really low, and it's harder to avoid predators. And so that's going to be challenging. An adult fish in a flood, they usually shift lower within the water column. They hide behind big boulders and rocks and some of our limestone bedrock veins and stuff. And they can just kind of hang out down there. The opposite is true, when it's really turbid, again, hard for them to find prey, hard for them to hunt. But when the water is a little green post flood, they can really start to gorge on prey. And that's why fishing during those times, you do pretty well because they're on the feed. But as far as our young of the year go, our baby bass that are born in May, they're kind of like canaries in the coal mine. If the water is too low, during June and July, their nursery areas are shrunken down. They get really hot. There's sometimes toxic algae that forms in those areas, and they're really stressed and they're pushed out into deeper water, and they get hammered. Also, if you have really high flows during the spawn, once these fish are fry, they're really susceptible to high flows. And so if you get a late May high flow, they get blown out, and there goes your year class. If it's early enough, these fish can, spawn, and, these spawns are a bell curve. And so if the first half of the spawn is blown out, some of them will renest, and then the late spawners, they'll come on and they'll finish the job, and you'll still get a decent year class out of it. But low, really low water and really high water are really stressful on juvenile fish. And so, they need it just right. And we haven't had the just right here in a few years. And you'll see that from the South Fork Shenandoah results, as well as the North Fork Shenandoah results.
Yeah.
So moving on to the South Fork, we got 9 sites on this river. We've collected this year over 700 fish. 26%, a quarter of the fish, are quality. That's great for the South Fork. It's staying consistent. The catch rate is a little bit lower. It's consistent, with 2023 at 87 fish per hour. But that is slightly below the long-term average. And on this next graph, this is again the total catch rate on the South Fork. And you can see that our time spent on the South Fork goes a lot further back than the North Fork. And that's just because we switched tactics on the North Fork and went with raft electrofishing. And so it's not really comparable to look at that older data with the raft electrofishing data. It just doesn't quite line up real well. But you can see that we've been pretty consistent going all the way back to the late 90s with the South Fork, sampling approximately like 7 to 9 sites every year. You can see that we are on a bit of a downtrend starting back in 2018. Again, that high water event, probably knocked a few fish out, dropping that 2019 sample. But the real story is with our young of the year production, which, you'll notice here from 2011 through 2016, we've had this big jump in the population, and you'll remember that we had some fish kills back then as well. The reason that the population was able to rebound is because we had really consistent spawning, and in some cases we had the second best or top spawn ever recorded. And so the population can really rebound quickly in those years. And because we had so many young of the year produced, it bumps up your total catch rate a little bit higher. So the anglers may not really feel it that much. They're not catching the little 3 and 4 inch young of the year. We are. And so the total catch rate is, through the roof in 2015, but That's because we had a really good spawn that year. And you'll see, our fish in our rivers, they're aging out by the time they're 8, 9, 10 years old. And so the quality fish that you guys are seeing now, they were born in 14, 15, 16, and 17. Those 2014 fish, that's a 10-year-old fish. That's a true trophy. There's not very many of those out there. But you can see that we had pretty good spawns there, 4 years in a row, above average or average. But ever since then, it's been pretty few and far between. We've got 5 years here that a really low spawning success. Those 2019 fish, those are the quality fish that you're seeing that are in that 11 to 14 inch size range. That's a 5-year-old fish. And then that 2021 year class has helped as well. But it's rare that this river sees 3 years in a row of poor spawning. In fact, we've never seen it. Most of the time it's 1 year off and then we're back again, 1 year off and they're back again. Every now and then we get 2 years in a row. But you can see, like we talked about earlier, 2 really low water, essentially record drought years in a row in 23 and 24. Just not great, not great for the spawn. They just don't like it. And so we need a bump. We need a good spawn this year. Hopefully we have a decent weather year and some decent flows.
How many, and you say like it's usually 1 year on, 1 year off is what you've seen. How many years do you need to really kick it back up? Because you look at going back 10 years, you had like 3 years in a row that really popped it off. Is that the standard where if you get 3 in a row, you could project out that you're going to have a good population of smallmouth on their way?
I have a great example of that on the main stem. If you have good growth within a fishery, it doesn't take very many spawns to change it. And even in this river, you have 1 or 2 good year classes after a fish kill event, and the river bounces back. And in 2005, that was our huge fish kill on the Shenandoah. And you can see in 6 and 7, we had, above average spawns right after that, not to mention the 2004 spawn, which was just monstrous. And so, if you look back at our total catch rate, sorry, it's going to take a second. It starts to take off within that 6, 7, 8 year time frame. That's kind of the beginning of this river's recovery. And so, it doesn't take very many. It doesn't take very many nests, and it doesn't take very many years of good spawning for a fishery to recover. This next graph shows kind of the layout of, it's called a length frequency histogram, and it's showing the number of smallmouth captured within the population, within our sample, and their sizes in millimeters. And so what I wanted to focus on is that even though we've had some poor spawns over the past few years, it's not like we don't have any young fish in the population. This is a very normalized length frequency graph that we see on the South Fork. A lot of 8 to 10 fish, 8 to 11 inch fish out there. That's pretty common for the South Fork. And even though we had really bad spawns, you can see the 80 millimeter to 140 millimeters area of the graph. There's still fish there. It's not like it was a complete bust. There are young fish in the population. And so we're not at risk of this river crashing or anything like that. In fact, those 8 to 11 inch fish are growing fast, and they're going to be moving into the more quality fish size classes here next year. And so I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see good fishing, and the 300 millimeter to 350 millimeter fish that people enjoyed catching this year. That's the 11 to 15 inch fish. They're going to be bumping up into the 14 to 18 inch size range next year. So it's not all bad news. It's concerning that we're not having good spawning. And it's concerning that we're seeing some health problems with our juvenile fish these past few years, but they're able to contribute to the population still, even though we've seen some fish with some lesions and fungus. This next one's busy. This breaks down our different size categories. So the blue line is all adult fish over 11 inches, and it's the number of fish that we capture per hour. So it's, again, going back to that CPUE, catch per unit of effort. The orange line is adult fish over 14 inches, and the gray line is adult fish over 17 inches. And the orange arrows show our fish kills, the reported fish kills where we actually had dead fish. And so you can see over time, 2005 and 2007 were two biggies. 2010, there were some reported. 2014 was another pretty good one where we lost some adult fish. And then I also wanted to show just how sometimes low water years can really impact our data. 2017 looks like a fish kill, but it was not. It was just so low and clear that we were just chasing fish around out there. And that's the real frustrating thing about fisheries is, you're at the whim of the weather. And when you have a real low clear year like that, sometimes the fish just don't cooperate. And so, that's the reason why it bounces back up so quickly in 2018, is because it's really somewhat of an outlier. But the main thing that I wanted to focus on is the consistency we've seen in these different categories over the past few years. Despite the fact that we have seen a little bit of a downturn in the total numbers, our catch rate of quality fish at 15 an hour is just rolling right along. For the past 4 years, we've had good, consistent numbers of quality fish in the system, and I'm hopeful that we can keep it that way. And if you look back through time, even before the fish kills, a lot of times you'll have people opining over the good old days. I remember we used to catch 100 fish per hour. Well, you didn't catch a lot of quality fish back then before the fish kills. We're seeing higher numbers of quality fish now than before when we used to sample back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So, it's not the worst thing in the world to have lower numbers within the population, because you have, more prey items out there, less competition, and the fish are growing faster. And you'll see that in the next graph. We did some age and growth work in 2023, and this shows the average length of an aged fish within the population. And the orange line is in 2000, the gray line is from 2019, and then the blue line is the most recent. That's supposed to say 2023. But you can see that in the early life stages, up to 4 years old, these fish are growing faster. And then especially, in that older age classes, these fish continue to grow quicker than the previous samples back in 2000. Granted, it gets a little wonky with some of these older age classes because we don't have real high sample sizes because there's just not that many of them out there. But the big thing is that these fish are growing quicker straight out of the nest than they have been, which means that an age 3 fish can get to quality sizes. It's getting almost up to 11 inches by age 3, whereas back in the year 2000, that was only a 9-inch fish. And so going back to your comment earlier about how quickly can these fisheries recover, if you get one good spawn in 3 years currently at their current growth rate, 3 or 4 years later, you're going to see an uptick in quality fish that you've been catching. So you don't. And I realize
with a lot of this stuff.
What's that?
Yeah, I was gonna say I realize with a lot of this stuff, it's never just one thing. But then you look at and like the sunfish population is on the rebound. The minnows are back, and so it feels like there's more stuff. I know that's something you guys don't specifically track, but it's not just okay. There's less population of smallmouth, therefore for competition they can feed more. But it's also like there is more items out there for them to feed on.
Yeah. And, and we do track, the sunfish population pretty carefully. Minnows are a little bit tougher to track, but it's really, I don't have the graph on this presentation, but if you look at that, at the smallmouth total catch rate during that 14, 15, 16, 17 year where it really peaks out, you can see a dip in response from the sunfish population. I mean, they're chowing on them. And so now that the smallmouth population is dipping a little bit, you're seeing that reaction from the sunfish. And so, again, in my opinion, it goes back to my earlier comment of it's not the worst thing ever to see a little bit of a downturn in the population with the South Fork, because it's always been a numbers fishery. The entire time that I've worked here, it's always just numbers, and there's just not that many big fish. And now we're starting to see a lot more quality fish and a more balanced fishery overall. When you can go out as an angler and maybe you're not catching 100 fish, maybe you're catching 30 fish a day, 50 fish a day if you're real good. And, a quarter of those fish are quality. And you're catching some quality sunfish on top of that. I'd take that over 100 dinks any day of the week.
I'm
That's my
glad you brought
personal
that up. I'm glad you brought that up, because everyone doesn't understand. It's hard, almost impossible, I think, as a manager to have population and size. It's always a give or take of which one is more preferable to the community or your stakeholders.
Correct. And the worst part is we don't have a whole lot of control over it.
Yeah.
If we can stock trout into a stream and make the population bigger, that's easy. But, raising smallmouth to a meaningful level to impact an entire fishery like this is probably impossible. Raising enough smallmouth to impact a section of one of these resources, I think that is more probable. And that's what we're really focusing on when we talk about stocking these fish. I'm just segueing like a champ today. So this is our stocking results for the South Fork. Granted, not nearly as many fish as we put into the North Fork. Again, those were surplus fish that went into that river. This is a much more structured stocking effort. We're stocking the same amount of fish every year that we do this project so that we can properly evaluate it. And so we stock this fish we stock this section of river from Newport to White House at a specific rate every year. And we mark them with OTC again. The difference is with this, we're hoping to start doing some genetic testing, and we're going to look at stock versus wild fish by genotyping the parents of the brood fish that we bring into the hatchery. And so if you look at their genetic code of the fish that I'm holding in my hand right there with the little fin clip, you can look at the DNA and compare it to the brood fish DNA and see whether this fish came from one of the parents in the hatchery or it came from, fish X from the wild. And that way you don't have to sacrifice the fish. We're still not quite dialed on that yet. We're working with a professor from Randolph-Macon, and we're collaborating with a geneticist from the North Carolina State Wildlife Agency as well. So we're hoping that they make a breakthrough there so we can utilize that over the next few years. We also stock a section in South River as well, 4,000 fish from Cremora to Grotto. So those are our two study sites that we're really going to be focusing on the next few years.
If you had to, this is not the scientific thing, but wager, it seems like the North Fork will potentially have the biggest pop from the stocking program. And would that be because of the size or just where you're starting from base levels of population? Yeah,
I think that the North Fork has a chance for sure because of size and because of lack of competition right now. The reason that we chose the South Fork and the South River is because, the funding that came to restore the Front Royal Hatchery to raise these fish came out of mitigation funds from the mercury spill into the Shenandoah River watershed, starting from the South River, flowing into the South Fork. And so those mitigation funds are geared towards raising fish to benefit the Shenandoah River. At the time when we were restoring the hatchery, we didn't really have a huge need for smallmouth bass because we had such good spawning on a consistent basis. But the South River, had a bit of a downturn. Spawning hasn't been quite as consistent there. And now on the South Fork, spawning has not been quite as consistent. And so this has become a much more valuable tool. But there are still a lot of fish, within the Newport to White House section. And so there's a fair amount of competition there. The reason we chose that section is because we have a lot of past data there, including some population level data where we know we have an estimate of the number of smallmouth per kilometer. We also have creel survey data where we've interviewed anglers and determined a catch rate. We've done at least 3 of those on the South Fork and then on the South River as well. So we have a lot of back data that we can compare to, whereas if we just pick the North Fork, we don't have the data set there. And so it'd be hard for us beyond just saying, the graph went up, it must have worked. With the South Fork and the South River, we'll be able to see if angler catch rates have gone up, whether we've made a population level impact with depletion results, and then just overall, whether our catch rates throughout the watershed have increased within this specific section, because we have 2 sample sites that we do on a yearly basis at Newport and at White House. And so we can look at that over time and see if the numbers start going through the roof in comparison to some of the other sites. So it's all about having comparable data within the history of a system to be able to tell if you really have an impact. And so I can understand why people scratch their heads a little bit, like, why are they stuck in the South Fork? It's got loads of fish. Certain sections do. The lower sections, have dropped off a little bit over the years. We had to pick sites where we had really good quality data so that we can make an educated evaluation of the program. Okay, I know you want to talk about sunfish, so we're going to talk about sunfish just real quick. A few other species that we sample for. The largemouth bass within the South Fork, they've always been kind of the best kept secret. Within every deeper, slower moving pool within the South Fork, every dam pool, there's good numbers of largemouth. Their population did take a bit of a dip back in 2016. I can't explain it. The habitat for them within the South Fork, it's not as plentiful as for a smallmouth bass, of course. And so it could just be that, the year class strength hasn't been there, but the population is about 50% of what it used to be within our sample sites. However, there's still a really good chance that you're going to catch a quality fish, because 60% of the adult fish that we catch are quality. And so if you're going to get one, it's most likely going to be a good fish. And then the sunfish, again, are back. We saw loads of rock bass this year, which was just delightful to see. And then just great hand-sized sunfish, the second highest catch rate ever since we started sampling the South Fork. And almost a quarter of the fish you catch are a quality sunfish. So, I mean, a rebel crayfish has no chance in the Shenandoah this year. As far as the musky go, another success story. We stocked just shy of 3,000 fingerlings this year. We had to change things up a little bit this year. Typically, we stock advanced fingerlings into the resources around the Commonwealth, but it was really hot, and we were worried about bringing the fingerlings into the hatchery and them experiencing high temperatures within the raceways and the ponds. And so we just decided to stock them direct. We get our fingerlings from North Carolina. We supply them with a few broodfish every year. They supply us with anywhere from 10 to 30,000 fingerlings. It's a real good deal. But as far as the numbers of muskie on the South Fork, we set the record for the highest catch rate in 2024. We did see a little bit of a dip in the citation level fish because we missed a bunch of stockings about 4 years in a row. And so we were rebuilding right now. So anglers can expect to see good numbers of 25-inch to 38-inch fish out there right now. And then the next few years, because of the last 4 years of consistent stocking, they're going to see those mid-30-inch fish push into that citation level fish. There's still some big ones out there for sure, but there has been a little bit of a downturn with the bigger fish over the last couple of years. And just like if you experience poor spawning for a few years in a row in the wild, if we don't stock these fish, the population starts to suffer. And so that's why it's so important to continue to stock these fish at a reasonable level to have a nice consistent catch rate for anglers. And now I do say, this was the record catch rate for 2024. It was slightly above previous catch rates and much lower than you'd see on the James River and the New River, for example. So the habitat in the South Fork and the main stem are not the same as the New and the James. There's much less contiguous pool habitat for these fish. And so they're very isolated within their little tiny populations throughout the South Fork. So you find a nice deep pool, you have a good chance of contacting these fish. But outside of that, you're not going to see these fish. It's best to float this river for smallmouth within the smallmouth habitat, and then switch over to musky or largemouth when you're in the pool habitat. Some bad news. We have spotted a few flatheads in the South Fork, and we caught our first snakehead in 2023. The snakehead was caught behind the Merck plant, which is between Island Ford and Elkton within the upper watershed. Someone just threw it in there. There's a big patch of grass within that section, and it came out of the grass, as they tend to do. We were able to catch it and dispose of it. We haven't seen one since, and we're hoping that whoever put it in there is done. It's not putting them in there anymore. Even worse, though, is the flathead catfish. We've discovered a few individuals below the Newport Dam. It's the only place we've seen them on the South Fork. We have not documented any spawning at this point. An angler did catch one the other day and disposed of it, and we have disposed of every one that we've encountered. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that no more have been added to the river illegally and that we've dodged this bullet. But I'm really hoping that the flatheads aren't going to take off here in the next year or so, like they have on the main stem. And we'll talk about that a little bit, because these fish, they really hammer sunfish. Yeah. And, we're bragging about our sunfish fisheries right now. They're doing so well. And I'm really scared that these fish are going to take off and have an impact going forward. So please do not stock fish. You need a permit to stock fish within our public waters, and you need a permit from us. So do not stock fish illegally, because you can have an impact on these fisheries. Fish for channel catfish. There are tons of channel catfish in the Shenandoah River. Okay, moving on to the main stem. All good?
Just processing. That flathead thing, I've seen what it did. I had the guys on from Maryland talking about what happened at Dam 4, Dam 5 on the Potomac, where the flathead, dude, for everyone that complains about snakehead, I'm not saying you had to pick the worst thing for an ecosystem. At least from what I've seen and I've talked to, the flathead can just wipe things out. They are vacuum cleaners is what they are. And they will put a hurting on any forage species, goggle eye, rockfish, and the sunfish. Yeah.
I agree. I'm much more scared of flatheads within our systems because they can survive and thrive within our habitat types here in the valley. The snakehead, I don't want them, but I'm not as scared, because where they like to live. They like those shallow, weedy backwater areas. And we have some vegetation on the South Fork and the main stem, but, for the most part, you got moving water. It's just not exactly what I picture a snakehead to really enjoy and thrive. We also have a lot of smallmouth and largemouth that would probably hammer some baby snakeheads. But I don't want them. But I'm really scared of the flatheads. They're a huge concern. And they're here to stay, unfortunately, on the main stem, and we'll talk about that. But this year we'll talk about the good news. The main stem is doing very well. And I'm really excited because I've sampled this river for a long time. I've seen it great. I've seen it not so great. And we're verging on getting back to that great category again. 230 smallmouth collected this year at 3 sites. 37% are considered quality. You're getting close to that 40% mark. That's a fantastic number. Slightly down from 2023, but there's still a high percentage chance that you're going to encounter a fish over 11 inches when you're on a float in this river. The catch rate is the best since 2015, 71 fish per hour. It's almost matching the South Fork, which is unheard of. And so you can see we've had some tough times on the main stem. Over the years, it's been pretty consistent between 60 and 100 fish an hour. 2005 was the big fish kill year. And so you can see that huge drop off there, but it bounced back, fairly quickly, again, through some bigger spawns that we experienced, and it stayed fairly consistent, throughout the early teens. But then we had that high flow event again in 2018. We weren't able to sample because of it. And we saw a pretty good drop off in 2019. Now, I don't know if I'm going to blame that all on that high flow event, because as you'll see in the next slide, we've had some pretty poor spawning success back through that time frame. But what I wanted to show is just that we are starting to climb out of the cellar here, especially the past 2 years, 2022, 23, 24. We're getting back to where we want to be here. And that's mostly because we've had a couple good years of spawning. You can see we were really struggling there for a long time. We had a fantastic spawn in 2014, set a record. And those fish are 10 years old now. So, those 20-inch fish, we've seen them in the past couple of years. There were some big bruisers out there in pretty good numbers, but they're starting to go now. They're starting to die out. 2015 was pretty decent. That helped, those big fish as well. But after that, man, we were getting hammered. We just didn't have any good spawning success. And that's going to have an impact on a resource when you have 5-6 years in a row of really poor spawns. But 2022 and 2023, all things considered, they were just about on the long-term average for spawns within this system. And so we're starting to see a bit of a recovery, and you can see that in the length frequency graph here. You can see those younger juvenile fish, those 8 to 10-inch fish within the system. And going back to your comment earlier about how fast a fishery can recover, depends on their growth rates. And the main stem has fantastic growth rates. So I'm going to take you through a quick sequence here, going back to 2021, when things were real sad, just across the board, really low numbers of fish, a few young fish in the system. It wasn't a complete bust as far as the young of the year go. The young of the year are located within that 110 to 140, 150 range. So there's some there, but not very many. And then those fish that, most average anglers catch, those 8 to 12-inch fish, just low numbers of those as well, even low numbers of trophy fish as well. In 2022, we got a slight bump in young of the year. And so this is the start of that recovery. And you can follow this through time. 2022, sorry, I screwed up there. 2021, 2022, there's our young fish, sorry. So a little bit of a bump there. Now those fish have grown into that, sorry, this is messed up. Hold on one sec. Okay, let me back up. I was scrambling for slides here. Okay, 2022, 2020, there we go. 2023, we've got a big bump, and you can see how quick the 2022 fish have moved into the 8 to 12-inch category. And it's really, bolstered our population level as a whole. And now 2024, we continue to see these fish carry across. There we go. 2024, you can see the difference there. I guess that really shows it well there. 2021, 2, 3, 4.
So question for you, habitat and forage on all three, north, south, Maine, how much does genetics play into this with their growth rates on the main stem compared to the other two? Would that be a factor at all?
No, I don't think so. There was some genetic work done through Virginia Tech a few years back, and the Shenandoah River drainage, they're just mutts. There's nothing overly special about them. I think the biggest thing is, you have lower numbers on the main stem, and those fish are going to grow fast and just extremely fast. And I'll show you a graph here. This is age and growth from 2023. And so this is the age of the fish, and then the length, their corresponding length. And so the orange line is the start of the quality fish metric. And so anything above that, is considered quality. So you're having so there's some outliers, but a 1-year-old fish is growing 12 inches long in the main stem. By 2 years old and 3 years old, especially, they are already above that quality metric.
That's insane.
And so it doesn't take very long for this fishery to recover. By 4, these fish are 16 inches long. And so you don't have to wait very long, which means that, that's why this chart here showing the various size classes from 2022 through 2024, we've seen this sharp increase in quality fish because we've had a couple of those spawns, and it's taken literally a year or two to get them into that blue line, that quality fish category of fish over 11 inches. Wow. So it doesn't take very long for these fish on the main stem to get back into a quality sized fish. And I need to look at some of the older age and growth data and see how it compares. It could be that the growth is similar to historic. I have a feeling it's probably faster, similar to the South Fork, that it's increased over time.
And you probably already mentioned this, but to repeat, is this from below Riverton to Millville? Is this below Riverton to 7?
I didn't mention that. It's a good question. Our area that we focus on is from the Warren Dam in Front Royal down to Route 7, to the West Virginia line. Our 3 sites are below the Warren Dam, at Route 50, and at Locks Landing. Those are the 3 sites.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of habitat. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
For sure. So, yeah. Moving on to the bad moments, the flathead are actively reproducing and expanding in the main stem. Back in 2021, we sampled a few up by Warren Dam, and an angler caught a few just above Morgan's Ford. We hadn't seen any spawning at that point. We dispatched, any fish that we did encounter, but it didn't take very long. I mean, the next year we caught 1 more, I think, and anglers were starting to report more. And then the following year, we started seeing young of the year, and we saw them all the way down to Route 50. And so now we're pretty much finding them at every site. I don't think we haven't caught one at Locks Landing yet, so they're not quite down that far, but they've been encountered down above the Millvale Dam in West Virginia. And so we're getting attacked at both ends here. I think probably they were illegally introduced up near the Warren Dam. And then there were also some down in the lower section of the Shenandoah in West Virginia. So they have free reign to come and go as they please, and they're spawning. And our catch rates are starting to increase pretty dramatically. They're not all that big yet. So I don't know what to expect from these fish. I don't know if they're going to grow into trophies or if they're going to stunt. The channel catfish on this river, they grow pretty well, grow into pretty decent fish. But I'm really concerned about the sunfish population because it is finally back. 40% of our sample of sunfish are quality fish. I mean, you can just have a day on the main stem catching sunfish. We also have walleye fry that we've been stocking on a yearly basis since 2019. That population is very stable. I don't think that the flathead will impact them very much, but I could be wrong. Hard to say. I don't know if that there's I guess maybe the Stanton River might have flatheads and walleye. I'm not sure, but
and the new, I think.
The new, of course.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Well, and speaking of the new, because I think I don't know if it was you, but this could be wrong. But like, is the walleye you got, the brood, is that a Stanton or the New River breed of walleye?
We request the New River strain of walleye for the main stem, but we have to take what we can get sometimes. And so there are years where we've gotten the Stanton strain as well. But we were able to stock 20,000 fry this year. The population peaked back in, I think, 2021. and then kind of came back down to earth once anglers discovered them. But we're growing some big fish. I mean, there's some fish over 30 inches out there.
What are you more impressed with over the years? How the muskie took to the river, or how the walleye took to the river?
And the walleye was just like, you pop them in there and boom, you got a fishery. It was easy peasy. With muskie, it took a while to figure out where you needed to put those fingerlings for them to succeed. For a long time, we stocked muskie into the Shenandoah River and we just put them in at boat ramps. And I think if they were able to find a pool quickly, they were able to survive. But a lot of times they didn't survive very well. And so it wasn't until back in like the early 2000s where we started strategically stocking these fish into pool habitat specifically, where we really started to see them take off. But with walleye, we dump half the load up by Warren Dam and then scatter the rest down through. And part of that reason is, just the homing ability of walleye. They're going to run back up to the Warren Dam to spawn. And we wanted that 10-mile stretch, from Morgan's Ford down to Route 50 to be kind of that spawning area where you could go and target these fish in the springtime and riffles and runs and pockets. And it's become that, you can go down through that section, in March when they're really starting their run, and you can encounter these fish right as you come out of a pool and it like slopes up to a riffle. A lot of times they're hanging out there. If you can find some like big potholes, in pockets behind islands, behind bedrock veins, they hold there. They're deep and they're waiting to spawn at night or on a real darker, cloudy day. A pretty cool fishery, and these fish are growing really well. The muskies, we continue to stock into the main stem. Their population is not doing as well as it used to. We used to see these fish from, Warren Dam down through Locks Landing. For whatever reason, they're just not thriving as much as they used to. We have had some pretty inconsistent stocking over the years, but the past 5-6 years, we've really done pretty well up there. And we're just not seeing them except for up in the Warren Dam area. And I think part of the reason is, these rivers are getting warmer. These fish are a cool water species. They really need a good spring influence to be healthy over the summer months. The walleye are cool fish too, but they don't seem to be bothered nearly as much as the muskie are. I think the muskie are just a little more sensitive. I did hear from an angler that caught one down at Locks Landing this year, which was the first time in a long time that I heard someone catching a muskie. So I'm not sure if that one was stocked and grew right there, or if it just moved down there and just happened to be caught there. But we really aren't seeing a lot of muskie on the Shenandoah anymore, except for up in the Warren Dam area where you do have a pretty big spring influence that allows them to over summer there pretty nicely.
I am surprised at how well the walleye, because again, like how hardy they are, because that is the classical, like the fish that you catch up north, ice fishing. They bite great in the wintertime. Travis Eden has talked about on the show. They bite great, but they also don't mind the heat, which I wouldn't have thought they would have handled it so well.
Right. And it could be that, having that New River strain is really important. It's a riverine species. It's grown up in Virginia, its whole existence. And so it can handle some of those warmer temperatures, where if you put a Wisconsin walleye down in the Shenandoah, it might boil. You might be able to just eat it right off the bone. But anyway, that's about all I've got for the Shenandoah as far as the popular report goes. As far as the wrap up, the North Fork, low numbers, but some quality fish, especially in the middle reaches. Red breast sunfish numbers are really high on the North Fork too. I think we're at the second highest catch rate all time this year. And again, good quality, hand size red breast sunfish. So don't overlook those in the North Fork either. South Fork, good smallies. Muskie are looking really good. We continue to work with USGS on fish health issues. We're waiting on some results from some of the adult testing we did last year. We continue to scratch our heads about the young of the year issues that we've seen And we're working with USGS on some projects there to look at largemouth bass virus and how these fish are taking up the virus at what stage. We have essentially a cage study where we're putting some of our hatchery raised smallmouth into these cages and then looking at what they take up throughout a 30-day period within the rivers. Didn't work out great last year. We're going to try to redo it this year. We're collaborating with Maryland on this study as well. But we continue to work hard to try to figure out what's causing health issues with these fish. It's not an easy nut to crack for certain, but the more we learn, the better we will be at managing these fisheries. As far as the main stem, low numbers, but great quality. And the numbers aren't really that low anymore. They're starting to climb up there. Walleye are great. There's some musky out there. The flatheads are unfortunate. Please stop stocking flatheads. And then the South River, the stocking project continues to commence. And the Maury River is a fantastic fishery. That's another one that I'm responsible for. Catch rate over 100 fish an hour. Over a quarter of the fish are quality. It's a sneaky river, floated in the spring and it still has some flow to it, and then wait it in the summertime or kayak it in the summertime when it gets real low. But good numbers of fish on the Maury for sure.
With the main stem, would that be something you could ever entertain in the future, as doing stocking, since you said like the numbers are low, or do you feel like it'll bounce back on its own?
I think we are limited by the numbers of fish we can raise, and we have. It's probably a conversation for another day, but we've got a lot of strategies that we're working towards in the future where we can upscale the successes that we've experienced this year. What we've learned this year with the work that we've done at Front Royal is that we can raise these fish both within the outdoor raceways on piles of gravel. We can't squeeze these fish like you can with a trout or a musky or a walleye and just and fertilize the eggs in a pan. You have to let them do it. And so you have to create conditions where they're comfortable, where they will spawn. And so in the outdoor concrete raceways, we put piles of gravel and they fan them just like they would in the river. And they lay their eggs, fertilize them, and guard them. And once those fry hatch out, we scoop them off the nests with really fine mesh nets, and then we put them into a pond, a lined pond that has tons of zooplankton in it, ready for them to feed on. Now, one thing we tried new last spring is we kept some brood fish within one of the lined ponds, and we put spawning baskets out there. It's basically just a Walmart Walmart Tupperware container, real shallow, that had a little bit of carpeting in the bottom and then some gravel. And they took to those just like they would in the raceways. In fact, they fanned more of those than they did nests in the raceways. And the reason we did that was twofold. One, we talked with South Carolina that had some success with raising these fish. And that's what they did in some of their mud ponds, because they didn't have a line ponds like we did. They didn't have outside raceways. And so they wanted a controlled way to kind of capture the eggs in the fry. And so they used these stocking baskets or spawning baskets. And it worked. We were able to get some fry from those. And the other thing is those ponds heat up faster, so we can bring in brood fish, put them in the ponds, hatch out fry, put those fry in a different pond, release those brood fish, flip that pond, and now we can bring in Lake Moomaw brood and put them into the concrete raceways and have them spawn in there, and then have room in the previous brood pond to put the Moomaw fry into. It's a big shell game, but it's a way that we can
that's impressive.
Expand the numbers of fish that we can raise. The problem is we only had about 4 nests in each. And so we're at a deficit in the numbers of fry that we're producing. And so this year we're going to try to do some habitat installations within the raceways, because if you walk by the raceway to make sure that the raceways aren't overflowing and the screens are flowing clean and the checking to see if they've fanned any nests. Those broodfish, they're just bouncing up and down the raceway. They're spooked like crazy. And so our idea this year is to create some artificial habitat structures adjacent to the nesting habitat. And that way they can hopefully just kind of hunker down behind a pallet, behind a Christmas tree, something like that. And they're not quite as stressed, running up and down the raceways. And hopefully that'll allow us to have a few more nests successfully reared. The other thing we're doing is we've kept some broodfish on site this year, and in the hopes to bolster our population. The other huge concern we have as an agency is the legal stocking of Alabama bass. Alabama bass will pollute the genetics of a smallmouth population by interbreeding with smallmouth, and essentially they will outcompete them and breed them out of existence until you just have these Alabama bass mutts. And so if you love smallmouth bass, do not stock Alabama bass. It's illegal to stock them in the state. Do not stock them anywhere. They ruin fisheries. Our concern is that, we have clean brood sources right now, but it only takes one person to illegally stock these fish, and then it taints that resource. And for that reason, we test our brood fish every year and make sure that they're pure smallmouth bass before the fish are stocked, which is really challenging as far as the turnaround time goes. But our other thought is if we can establish an in-house brood source that's clean, that are pure smallmouth, that'll allow us more freedom and less stress as far as bringing new fish in every year out of the wild, because you just never know when you're going to bring in that rogue fish that might have some Alabama bass genes.
Interesting.
So we're going to see how they hold over. There's no guarantee. The good news is we kept them in a line pond over the summer, fed them lots of minnows, and their total weight increased over the summer pretty dramatically. They looked like little footballs coming out of there. And so I was really concerned that the hotter temperatures were going to really stress them out, and they were not going to be in very good fit condition going into the winter. But they looked really good. And so we put them into an overwintering pond, and we still have plenty of minnows out there for them. And we'll refresh that food as necessary. They're not feeding a ton over the winter time, but in the spring, they're going to start to feed in anticipation of the spawn. And so we'll pull those out of that wintering pond and put them directly into that broodfish pond that we used last year with those spawning baskets. And then we'll add some more wild brood on there to bolster those numbers, with the hopes to really overwhelm that pond and create just a ton of fry. My goal is to overwhelm this hatchery with fry to the point where we don't have enough space to put them in ponds, and we have to outsource the fry to a different hatchery on the other side of the state. And that's how we can really generate a lot of numbers to where we can maybe make a difference in one of these larger systems, like a section of the James River or a section of the main stem.
That would be amazing. Wow. How did Mooney factor into all of this? Moomaw. Yeah. Wrong lake.
It factored in that it has a very strong smallmouth population, very healthy smallmouth population, and they spawn later because they're up in the mountains. And so it allows us to bring them in as a secondary brood source in case the first brood source fails, or we get some fry from them and then we send them out the door, and then we have the second batch to bolster those numbers. Because there's not a lot of, if you look into some of the literature in Texas, they've had a really good program over the years, and they show if you really overwhelm a pond, you'll have a pretty drawn out spawning period. But I think if you've got pretty low numbers of brood within an acre pond, some of them spawn, and there's, like I said before, it's a bell curve. There's a peak and then it drops off. And at some point you have to kind of decide, okay, they're done. We got to move on to the next thing. And so by having that secondary brood source that spawns later, we're able to hedge our bets a little bit and not just rely on that first brood source to produce what we need.
Interesting. I didn't know Texas did smallmouth. I thought it was like North Carolina, well, Maryland doesn't do it anymore, and you guys. So it's a really short list of people that have been successful with this.
Yeah. So Texas, they did a really extensive study back in the 90s, and they have a very large system, a very well-funded hatchery system. I'll say that. And so they were really specific on how they handled the eggs. They actually took the eggs out of the nest and put them into hatching jars, and they were able to, increase their numbers raised dramatically from that. Because if you leave them in the nesting box, you leave them in the raceways, they can get fungus. If you have a high flow event within the stream, there can be silt that comes in and lays on the eggs, and maybe you have a cold snap and the parents leave the nest and they're just not as diligent. And so there's some variables there you really can't control for. And so by taking them off the nest and putting them into jars, hatching jars, you can, expand your numbers pretty dramatically. But there's maybe some thoughts of doing that more intensive husbandry down the road. You have to remember that there's 2 full-time people at this hatchery and 1 part-timer. So, you have to keep the hatchery running. You have to stock trout, and you also have to raise walleye and smallmouth and the whole 9 yards. And so, and keep up with your feeder fish. We have a lot of minnows on site as well. And so I think it's something we may look into in the future. I'd like to talk to them directly and see if they are still doing this down in Texas, and if they've updated some of their techniques. But you're right. North Carolina has done some work with raising smallmouth and continues to do so. They're actually trying to do it to combat Alabama bass. That's their goal, is to try to stock them in areas where Alabamas are taking over, just to preserve some semblance of a smallmouth fishery. They'll never stock them. In my opinion, I don't think they'll ever stock them and outcompete the Alabama bass, but at least they won't just have a fishery full of hybrids. Georgia does some work with raising smallmouth at a pretty small scale. I know West Virginia's tried a little bit. I think they have the same issues we have sometimes with dealing with some of our older infrastructure. But it all changes when you get a little bit of a restoration up there at Front Royal. It's really a breath of fresh air up there working in that hatchery, and it's been very successful so far as like the infrastructure responding to what it was promised to do. And so that's been very nice. But Maryland, I think they've kind of paused their efforts. I don't think they're ever going to do it again. But, like us, we're not going to just stock them to stock them. We're going to stock them if there's a need. But first things first, we have to be able to meet allocations that are requested. And so figuring out the husbandry part of raising these fish would be a gigantic win, a huge hurdle to cross, and one that may have positive impacts on other states as well. So we continue to research and work hard on this.
I agree with you there, because I think it was interesting how this whole story started for many states about just, recouping their smallmouth populations due to, high water events, bad spawn, but it's kind of morphed into to preserve the genetics of the species because of Alabama bass. And somebody's got to get good at this, because that train's not stopping.
Right.
And so it's interesting to see that the need has changed, and just getting this cracked, because it was for the longest time. I've talked to you people in Maryland and stuff. This is hard. It's not, it's close to rocket scientists to get these stupid things to cooperate in captivity.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a huge challenge, which makes it intriguing, but also extremely frustrating. And I think the biggest frustration is just the fact that, we're never going to be able to raise millions of smallmouth, which is probably what is necessary. But there, I think at first, some of the other biologists that had worked with these fish, back in the early teens, trying to raise them and stock them and evaluate how they survive in the wild, they kind of looked at this project and were just like, we kind of went down this path before. It didn't go so well. But now that they've seen some of the results that we've come up with, as far as raising them in the hatchery, at least, it's kind of piqued their interest a little bit. And they're just like, there's a little bit of hope building there. So that's pretty exciting to see. There's definitely potential there. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to whether they actually contribute to the fishery. And that comes down to real strict evaluation of what we're doing. And so the rubber meets the road starting next year, where we see how those 1-year-old fish look. We'll go out this coming May, and we'll go to a number of locations within our sample sites on South River, as well as on South Fork. And we'll look for 1-year-old fish, and we'll either test them genetically, or we'll look for OTC marks and determine whether that's a wild fish or a stocked fish. And we'll see how it shows, how it all shakes out. And then of course the North Fork will be interesting as well, going and sampling that in May. We had a pretty good pulse of fish that went into that river. So if we go out there and we're seeing juvenile fish just popping up all over the place, that'll be really exciting.
Jason, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I know we're in the throes of winter, but when are you going to be gearing up to get back out there and do it all over again?
Pretty soon. I'm going out to Lake Shenandoah today. We're going to do some musky sampling on that lake. And then in January, we do our typical wintertime sampling for musky on the South Fork and one site on the main stem. We'll also be doing some fish habitat work in January on Lake Moomaw, Lake Frederick, and possibly 1 or 2 other small impoundments. And then springtime, things go crazy. We start collecting brood fish at the end of April. We're stocking like crazy March, April, and May. We're starting to sample our reservoirs in May. We're starting to sample the Maury and the North Fork Shenandoah with raptor electrofishing in May. Fryer hatching in May. Everything happens in May. It's a crazy month. So we're resting up a little bit right now in getting prepared for those field ops. But we'll be back out there very soon.
Awesome stuff. As always, guys, link in the episode description to everything that we talked about today. I'm putting a link also to the Virginia's DWR website. You can go check out all the literature if you want to get in depth. Give them a follow. And we'll see you guys next time on Fishing the DMV. Bye. You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your host, Thomas Ahrens. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.